This story is about the Forgotten Hospital. I had always been fascinated by the abandoned buildings scattered around our town. There was one in particular, the old hospital on the hill, that had a reputation for being haunted. Locals swapped scary stories about it, the kinds of true horror stories that would make you second-guess going anywhere near it. But I couldn't resist. One night, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the abandoned building, determined to find out if the tales were true. As I stepped inside, the air immediately turned icy, filling my lungs with a chill that settled deep in my bones. The halls were pitch dark, the only sound the faint hum of wind seeping through broken windows. Every step echoed, making the place feel alive somehow, like it was watching me. I pressed forward, flashlight scanning the peeling walls and scattered debris, my pulse quickening with each shadow that flitted by. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon an old surgical room, the walls lined with rusty instruments that had been left behind. The sight was eerie, but it was the feeling that got to me, a weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe. I knew I shouldn't linger, yet something drew me further in. I raised my flashlight to the far corner, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still, its back turned to me. It looked like a person in a faded hospital gown, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn and run, but I was frozen. I couldn't look away. Slowly, it began to turn, its head moving first, twisting far past what should have been possible. The face that met mine was hollow, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Its mouth was stretched into an agonizing scream, but no sound came out. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a shiver racing down my spine. This wasn't just a creepy story or ghost story, this was real, and I was trapped in it. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, only to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps following me. I turned, but the hall was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I raced down a series of corridors, only to find myself lost in a labyrinth of endless rooms and hallways, each one more oppressive than the last. The shadows seemed to deepen, twisting into shapes that crawled along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a faint, sorrowful moan, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls, surrounding me. I stumbled forward, desperate to find an exit, but the darkness seemed to close in, swallowing every trace of light. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, praying it would still have battery, but before I could pull it out, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. My heart stopped as I whipped around, only to find nothing. But the feeling lingered, like someone, or something, was right there, breathing down my neck. Out of sheer terror, I took a step back, and that's when I noticed something glinting on the floor, a small, dusty mirror lying on its side. With a shaking hand, I picked it up and aimed it in front of me, using the reflection to check my surroundings. And then I saw it, a figure standing right behind me, its eyes empty, staring into my soul. I screamed and threw the mirror down, shattering it. The pieces scattered, each shard reflecting those hollow eyes staring back at me. I turned to run, but the halls began to shift, each corridor leading nowhere. I was trapped, caught in the middle of a twisted paranormal story come to life. Finally, I found a staircase leading down to what I hoped was an exit. I didn't think twice, I bolted down, barely touching each step. But as I reached the landing, the shadows seemed to rise, forming into figures, multiple figures, each one reaching for me with skeletal hands. Their mouths opened in silent screams, filling the air with a chill that felt like death itself. I knew this wasn't just a haunting. This was something darker, something far more insidious. As I backed away, my flashlight flickered on just long enough to reveal a wall covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't understand, but they felt wrong, evil. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered my name, sending a cold shiver through me. It felt like a curse, a binding that had trapped me in this place. In a last-ditch effort, I charged through the shadows, feeling their icy grip tear at my skin, pulling me back. But somehow, I broke free, sprinting through the darkened halls until I finally saw a faint sliver of moonlight marking the exit. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs. As I looked back, the hospital loomed in silence, its windows dark and empty. But I knew they were watching me, those hollow eyes burned into my mind. I had become part of the building's true scary horror stories, one of the countless souls who had encountered the dark secrets hidden within its walls. And as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, a presence lurking just out of sight, waiting for the chance to return. This story is about the abandoned factory. It was supposed to be a dare, just a night of harmless fun. My friends and I had heard plenty of scary stories about the abandoned textile factory on the edge of town, but none of us actually believed in haunted stories. So when someone suggested we spend the night there, I foolishly agreed, thinking it would just be another creepy story to laugh about later. But I had no idea I was about to become part of one of the true scary horror stories that would haunt me for years. The factory had been closed for decades, the local legend claiming that it was haunted by the spirits of workers who had lost their lives in a fire. As we stepped inside, the air turned thick, filled with a strange, damp smell that clung to everything. We wandered through empty corridors, broken machinery scattered around us, casting twisted shadows on the walls. It didn't take long for an intense feeling of unease to set in. Each of us grew quieter as we moved deeper into the factory, feeling as though we were being watched. At one point, I felt a strange pull, an urge to turn down a dark hallway, away from the others. I glanced back, but none of my friends noticed I'd wandered off. I took a few hesitant steps, the darkness swallowing me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. My skin prickled as I strained to make out the words. They were faint, a language I couldn't understand. I forced myself to keep moving forward, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Ahead, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, perfectly still. I called out, assuming it was one of my friends trying to mess with me, but there was no response. The figure stood there, motionless, blending with the dark. My heart pounded, a sense of chilling scares settling over me as I took a step closer. Just as I moved forward, the figure turned slightly, and I could see its face, hollow eyes and a twisted, agonizing expression. It looked like an old photograph I'd seen of factory workers, covered in soot and grime. It was as if it had walked right out of the factory's horrific past. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a piece of rusted metal. The sound broke whatever spell held me, and I turned and ran back to find my friends, every shadow suddenly feeling like it was reaching for me. When I finally found them, they were standing in the main room, their faces pale and tense. They had heard the whispers too, soft voices echoing in the empty corridors, coming from every direction. One friend swore he saw dark shapes moving, shadows that vanished the moment he looked at them directly. We knew we had to leave. But finding our way out was harder than expected. Each hallway twisted into another, and somehow, no matter how far we walked, we ended up right back where we'd started. It was as if the factory itself had come alive, shifting around us, trapping us within its dark walls. I was about to lose hope when I noticed an old mirror leaning against the wall. Covered in dust, it reflected the faintest glimmers of movement behind us, dark shapes, like figures lurking just beyond our reach. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly, flickering glow across the room. They shouldn't have been working anymore, but in that brief light, I saw them clearly. Ghostly figures, workers in torn clothes, eyes full of rage and despair, stood before us, staring with expressions that chilled me to the bone. They were reaching out, their twisted, burned hands moving toward us. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin as I stared, unable to move, my mind frozen with terror. In a desperate attempt to escape, my friends grabbed my arm, dragging me through a series of hallways as we ran for our lives. The echoes of our footsteps bounced off the walls, followed by the relentless whispers and footsteps that didn't belong to us. The walls themselves seemed to close in, like they were trying to trap us in a horrifying embrace. We raced blindly down a dark hallway, pushing forward even as the air grew heavier, almost choking us. We stumbled into an empty room, the faint moonlight seeping through a cracked window. As we paused, catching our breaths, I heard a soft creak, followed by a faint scratching on the door we'd just come through. A shadow loomed in the narrow glass pane, unmoving but unmistakably watching us. It felt like the place itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling, like it was alive. Just then, I heard a soft, eerie laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the factory, a sound that seemed to wrap itself around my spine. Finally, I spotted an old, rusty staircase. With no other options, we sprinted toward it, climbing down with our hands gripping the railing as we stumbled, our footsteps loud and frantic in the stillness. I could feel those hollow eyes on my back, as if the ghosts of the factory were just inches away, following us, reaching out with cold, skeletal fingers. As we reached the ground floor, my friend yanked open a heavy metal door that led outside, and we burst into the night air. Gasping, I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs, breaking the factory's oppressive grip. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I looked back, I saw a shadow in one of the broken windows, the faint outline of a face with hollow eyes filled with hatred. It was as if we'd disturbed something ancient and evil, something that would follow us forever. We never spoke of that night again, but I could never shake the feeling that I'd brought something home with me. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my room, hear faint whispers in the dead of night, and feel cold fingers trailing down my back as I lay in bed. It's like the factory had become a part of me, and no matter where I went, it was waiting, lurking just out of sight. This story is about the Forgotten Asylum. I'll never forget the night I found myself trapped in the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The place was infamous, known among locals for being one of the most haunted buildings in the area. Stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and chilling scares kept most people far away. But I was young and looking for a thrill, thinking it would be another story to laugh about. I had no idea I was about to become part of one of the true horror stories that would haunt me forever. The asylum was massive, its walls cracked and peeling, vines weaving through broken windows. I climbed through a shattered window, my flashlight casting weak beams across the dark, endless hallways. There was a damp, musty smell, mixed with something metallic and unsettling, like the air was infused with the memories of those who'd suffered there. Every step I took echoed around me, swallowed by the thick silence that felt as if it was alive, holding its breath, waiting. As I moved further in, I saw faded murals on the walls, eerie depictions of faces twisted in agony, their hollow eyes following me. I could almost feel their pain seeping through the walls, the suffering they'd endured within these cold, sterile rooms. I wandered into what looked like a treatment room, its rusted medical equipment frozen in time, and that's when I heard it, a faint, barely there whisper. It echoed off the cracked tiles, words I couldn't understand but felt deep within my bones. It was like the voices of those who'd been confined here, trapped even in death, unable to move on. Shivers ran down my spine as I moved further down the corridor, stepping into the dim, empty rooms that once housed patients. The air grew colder, every shadow seemed to shift, to move, to watch me. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it toward the shadow, but by the time the light steadied, the figure was gone. My heart pounded as I walked toward the spot where the shadow had stood, only to find an old mirror leaning against the wall. Its surface was cracked, covered in dust, but when I looked into it, I froze. Staring back at me was not my reflection, but the face of a woman, her hollow, sunken eyes filled with rage and sadness. Her pale skin was covered in bruises, her mouth twisted in silent agony. I stumbled back, but as I looked away, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone, or at least, I should have been. I forced myself to move, to push past the fear that threatened to paralyze me. Every sound in the building felt amplified, like the faint creaking of floorboards and distant whispers were all around me, like the asylum itself was breathing, waiting for me to let my guard down. As I turned into another hallway, I felt that cold touch again, this time lingering, as if someone or something wanted me to stay, to be a part of this haunted story. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, I heard something unmistakable, a soft, eerie laughter echoing down the hallway. It was faint, childlike, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, filling the silence, drawing me deeper into the darkness. Then, as I approached the room at the end of the hall, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was creeping closer, closing in. I stopped, my breath hitching as I turned to look, but there was no one there. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief second of darkness, I saw the woman's face once more, her eyes boring into me, filled with a hatred that felt ancient and consuming. Panicked, I ran down the corridor, the laughter still ringing in my ears. I passed room after room, each one seeming more twisted and decayed than the last, until I found myself in a large open space, a place that must have once been the common room. Chairs were strewn about, a few overturned tables, and on the walls, scrawled in what looked like faded blood, were words that made my heart pound faster: "They'll never let you leave." I couldn't breathe, it felt as if the walls were closing in, pressing down on me. I turned, desperate to find an exit, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing right in front of the doorway. Its eyes were empty, hollow, staring straight at me. It had no face, just a dark, shapeless outline, but I could feel its gaze burning into me, pinning me in place. The figure moved closer, gliding across the floor without a sound, its twisted form reaching out as if it wanted to pull me into the darkness with it. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and in that moment, I felt a cold, skeletal hand wrap around my wrist, pulling me down. I screamed, yanking my arm free, scrambling to pick up my flashlight. When the light flickered on again, the figure was gone. I didn't waste a second. I bolted for the door, running through the dark, winding corridors, the echoes of the laughter and whispers following me, as if the asylum itself was alive, hungry to keep me within its walls forever. When I finally burst out into the night, I didn't stop running until I was far away from the building, panting, shaking. But even as I stood there, staring back at the dark silhouette of the asylum, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that didn't want to let me go.